Hello everybody, welcome, thank you for joining us today. You are part of the 250 people worldwide who have registered to view this webcast powered by YOL Development, dedicated to micro and mini LED industry. My name is Faisal El-Khamasi, and I am Global Sales Support and Coordinator for YOL Development. Before we get started with this webcast, just would like to give you some information regarding the logistics. You have the possibility during all the webcast to submit questions. In order to do so, you simply have to use the box at the bottom of the screen labeled Ask a Question. We will answer as many questions today as time permits, and for the remaining question, we will make a following up via emails within a week. Concerning the materials and contents, please note that the presentation is available and downloadable in the resource section. You will also receive an email after the webcast within 24 hours with a link to the recorded session. Let's now start the webcast presented by Zine Bouhamari and Eric Viere, both displays technology and market analysts within YOL Development. Zine, if you please.
Thank you, Faisal. Good morning, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us. As Faisal mentioned, my name is Zine, and alongside with Eric today, we would like to talk about mini LEDs and micro LEDs in displays in a general sense of the word. First off, as mentioned, we are a technology and market research company with many analysts covering three main domains, of which we represent the photonics and sensing division, and our focus is mainly on displays. All that we'll say here is based on our display reports collection. Even though some have 2019 and it's almost 2020, they've been released very recently these past few months and will be completely up to date for months to come. Note that we will soon provide updated versions of two of our reports, the micro LED displays IP and the displays and optics for VR and AR. And if you have a specific need about displays, contact our sales team for more information. Now, as an introduction, I would like us to come back on the LED vernacular, segmenting through chip size. We start with traditional LEDs, with which you are all probably fairly familiar with. You can find them in your ceilings, your reading lamps, your cars, etc. And then we have what we call the micro LEDs, at much smaller dimensions, typically less than 30 to 50 microns. And the buzz that started in 2014 when Apple bought LuxView, and for which targeted applications are consumer self-emissive displays, TVs, smartphones, etc. And then, since 2017, we hear more and more people talking about mini LEDs, below 200 micron or so. As there was this idea that mini LEDs would be helping bridge the gap between traditional and micro LEDs, we'll show you today how that is not true at all. Just in terms of applications, we see that the targets are different. Micro LEDs are about self-emissive displays, and mini LEDs are about mostly backlight units. What does that mean? That's what we're going to address right now. So, mini LEDs for backlight units. The backlight units is what you have behind your liquid crystals for your LCD display, which is most likely the display with which you are following this webcast. This is the incumbent flat panel technology, and basically your backlight is made of white LEDs. The white light is filtered by liquid crystals for every pixel, and then this light goes through color filters. Mixing those colors gives you all the different colors that you have on your screen. Now to have black, if all your backlight is lit up, but only your liquid crystals have to do the work, then it's okay, as long as it can filter out the light. Unfortunately, there's always some kind of very faint light leakage, even if they are supposedly completely shut off. That's why when you have a very dark image, like remember Game of Thrones episode this year, season 8, episode 3, you actually see some white halos instead of pure black. And pure black is what you get with a self-emissive technology, like OLED or micro LED. Each pixel can light itself up or switch itself off independently. For LCDs to reach these levels, the idea is to try and have a distributed LED network, independently controllable in zones to be able to completely switch off the backlight unit when needed to display a pure black. Now, as you can see here on this graph, increasing these zones throughout the evolution of LCD technology has been the natural way to improve visual fidelity. And mini-LEDs are at the verge of competing with self-emissive technology. With mini-LEDs, one can imagine doing two things. This is a traditional backlight unit, and as you can see, these are regular LEDs. Given their emission pattern, this gives a certain optical distance, which is linked to the thickness of the panel. Now, reducing the size of the chips but increasing their numbers, you can imagine playing on this size and reduce the thickness. That's what we can do with mini-LEDs. But on top of that, as previously mentioned, you can also play with the number of zones to improve black reproduction and perception. Here's an example with 12 zones, and here is the same image on the same TV, but with a different number of zones, 192 of them. And as you can see, where it's supposed to be black, you see real black. And this shows you just how much you can drastically improve on the contrast. So you could sum up by saying the mini-LED technology is the one of an LCD with a supercharged backlight unit. Improving contrast, reducing thickness to bridge the gap with OLED, possibly, as competition with this new technology for the high-end market increases, as we'll see later. The other potential benefits, apart from enhancing the contrast ratio, which is, as a reminder, the maximum white level over the lowest black level, would be enhancing also the power management. Or, for example, enhancing the image processing. You can, for example, play on the number of LEDs to light up, on the scanning that you do on the different zones, etc. So we hear about mini-LEDs everywhere now. And in 2019, we've seen some prototypes. Here are a few examples. Comcat CES 2019. Sharp also, CES 2019. There are many prototypes and product announcements being made on very different applications and from many different OEMs and panel makers, among which there could be Apple, from whom we should be possibly expecting maybe possibly an iPad Pro with mini-LEDs, a MacBook Pro at the end of the day, and most likely some other product by 2020 and then 2021. But looking at what's commercially available today, there are still very few products on the market. Notably, we have, for example, this Asus professional monitor, or, for example, this TCL TV, which are all passively driven, interestingly, and these deliver very great results, though at quite steep prices compared to regular LCD panels. But when looking at things, actually we see that the dimensions are not really what we call mini-LEDs. And this chip size maybe explain the price. We don't know. Now the debate is how many zones do we use? Actually, when plotting all product announcements, prototypes, demos that we've heard about or seen about, we don't really think there is a wide consensus. Sometimes you have a huge spread over a single application. Here are smartphones, then laptops, etc. And basically, this spread can be over 1 or 2 orders of magnitude. This is just probably a proof of how young and immature this still all is. And we can't really feel a consensus in between all the different makers. Now, we were talking about the number of zones, but we can also take a look at the number of chips that we can put in each zone. And now the consensus seems to come in terms of the number of mini-LEDs per dimming zone. Looks like going above 40 or 50 mini-LED per zone is not preferred. This is possibly for cost or driving complexity. And speaking of driving, as we were mentioning, the previous products were passively driven, and now we are hearing more and more about active driving. we can sense possible disruption, and the question is asked, how about driving actively those mini LEDs in the backlight? This is a prototype that we've heard several months ago about, and we hear more and more about this possibility, and we'll see right after why it exists. But basically, it's about what you use as a driver and the TFTs beneath that. But overall, there are many complex trade-offs to make in terms of technology choices, manufacturability and costs, and performance. For example, we just discussed the number of zones and the number of LEDs per zone. Now, to maintain an acceptable price, we were talking about the size that we should adopt for the mini LEDs, because the chip surface will drive it. But what should be the size? And if it's too small, how about placing it? Isn't it going to be more difficult? Knowing that we are talking about consumer products, where the end price is of utmost importance. How about the assembly cost, the total assembly cost? And then how about the driving? So we have active driving or passive driving. And basically, you could choose either using PCB or glass. So what's going to be the cost, again, on all this? So as you can see, many multiple and complex trade-offs. And now, just a thing about the dual cell solution, because mini LED is not the only path towards improving LCD contrast. Here, the idea is that you just stack two LCD panels, and the first will act as a local dimming array, for the second one being the regular one. We have seen some demos and products out for these. And, well, it adds on costs, that's for sure. On power consumption, that's for sure also. But there's an interesting incentive on the infrastructure. Can it absorb the overall large LCD overcapacity that we have today? We'll see more about that afterwards also. Now, to conclude, why speaking about mini LEDs and micro LEDs at the same time, knowing that during the introduction, there's no need to, we were mentioning that they were very different. At CES 2018, Samsung coined the term micro LED with the wall when it was a simple mini LED TV. In 2019, they came with something much more resembling micro LED. What to expect in 2020? Eric, to whom I hand the microphone now, will be there this year, so get in touch if you want to meet him. And now, Eric, to tell us more about micro LEDs, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Zine. And moving on to micro LEDs, I'm assuming that most of our listeners are already familiar with the concept. So just a quick reminders, micro LEDs, in a sense, very similar to OLED, in the sense that they're self-emitting micro displays or any type of displays. And by self-emitting, as Zine mentioned, we mean that every single pixel and subpixel is its own independently controllable light source. But unlike OLED, you cannot manufacture inorganic LEDs over large areas, so they're manufactured using more traditional semiconductor types of technologies on wafers, typically 4-inch to 8-inch. And the art of assembling a micro LED displays is to singulate every single chip or die and then move them and assemble them on the backplane. And you can do it the way it's shown here, starting from red, green, and blue LED wafers, or you can do it starting just from blue or even UV micro LEDs and combining that with pattern color conversion layers. So I won't go into the details of the pros and cons of doing that. You can refer to our full report, but it's definitely a credible route, credible options. In terms of performance, I would say the micro LEDs retain the best of OLED and LCD. As self-emissive display, they definitely retain all the benefits of OLEDs, but they could offer even better performance than OLEDs in terms of power consumption, brightness and contrast, wider color gamut. And they're also very rugged material, which means that you don't need to deploy complex and expensive encapsulation technologies to protect them from the environment. So with all those attributes, it's no surprise that a lot of people have shown interest in the technologies. Obviously, there's no consumer micro LED product on the market yet, so a good proxy to track the level of activities and identify the key player is to look at intellectual property trends, which is something we've been doing for the past 3 years now with our friends at Nomade. And as you can see here, this graph showing the number of patent families filed every year, you can see that the level of activity has been increasing pretty much exponentially, especially since 2014, which is probably no coincidence because this is also the year when Apple clearly showed strong interest in the technologies by acquiring microLED startup LuxView. So by now we have more than 240 organizations that have filed IP patents on microLED displays, and this graph is almost a year old now. We're in the process of updating that for the next report in early Q2, and I can already tell you that the trends definitely appears to be continuing. So all this research activity is starting to bear fruit. And this year, we've also seen a lot of new microLED display prototypes. We now have close to 20 companies that have shown prototypes. What's interesting is that they really cover the whole gamut of size, application, and also in terms of the technology solutions and processes that are deployed to solve some of the key issues associated with microLED display manufacturing. So we are seeing CMOS backplane, we are seeing traditional TFT backplane, be it LTPS or oxide. We're also seeing some companies getting rid completely of the traditional TFT backplane and using CMOS pixel level microdrivers. We're seeing all kinds of mass transfer and assembly technologies. We're seeing native RGB, as well as color conversion by phosphors, quantum dots, etc. So it shows the phenomenal level of creativity of the teams working on those issues, but it also shows that the technology is not very mature yet, and there's no convergence yet in terms of process and technology solutions. Overall, the STEM is growing as well. One notable difference this year is that a lot of the traditional display makers that for the most were a little bit late in getting into micro LEDs. There are some exceptions. Sony obviously was one of the pioneers. AU also showed some early on interest. But overall, display makers were a little bit lagging behind, and over the past, I would say, 18 months, we've seen the patent level of activity increasing very significantly at all the major display makers. For now, a lot of the technology solutions that are being deployed for micro LED, be it assembly, testing, etc., are still very specific, proprietary, lab level, tabletop type of experiments. So when times comes to ramp up the supply chain, there's going to be a need to significantly improve the supply chain, and especially access to off-the-shelf equipment with capabilities for mass manufacturing. And here also we're starting to see the activity increasing with a lot of the traditional display equipment makers now showing strong interest and working on developing dedicated equipment, be it testing, repair, all type of metrology, as well as transfer equipment. Same thing can be said for the CMOS backplanes. And we're also starting to see some the first pilot line. MiniTRIDE has set up its pilot line. Sanan is planning to build, or is currently building, the first micro LED production line, and we also arguably have some dedicated line at Plessey in the UK, Aledia in France just moving in a new fab, and companies such as Glow are already setting up the supply chain with partners. So we are not that, definitely, I wouldn't call it a full supply chain yet. We are not in volume manufacturing, but we're definitely seeing micro LEDs taking baby steps out of the lab and heading toward higher volume manufacturing. So overall, we're seeing a lot of vectors pointing in the right direction, being in terms of the level of activities, level of funding, technology progressing on all fronts, and supply chain starting to emerge. That said, there's still a lot of challenges, and at Yale, we've been, I would say, the bulk of our work has been in identifying and analyzing the challenges or potential roadblock and showstoppers for microLEDs. So I'm just going to illustrate a few of them. The first one, obviously, is cost. How do we go from that 146 4K TV, the wall by Samsung? There's no public price, but it's probably going to set you back about $250,000 for that 4K TV. So how do we go from there to a more palatable price compatible with consumers' expectations? The elephant in the room initially was the transfer and assembly. So to assemble a 8K microLED TV, to assemble about 100 million microLED die that are the size of a bacteria, more or less, and you need to assemble that with a precision placement accuracy of 1 micron. And you want to do that in just a few minutes to be viable economically. So if you try to do that with the best equipment available today on the market for die bonding, die assembly, with that level of accuracy, it's going to take you about 10, 11 years to assemble a single TV. So there's definitely a need to dramatically increase the assembly speed and come up with breakthrough technology with throughput at least 5 orders of magnitude higher than established technologies. Fortunately, a lot of smart people have been working on that, and we've also been looking carefully at that at Yale, studying all the patents. We typically organize the transfer technology in 3 major families, but for each we can use all types of technologies and processes to detach the die from the donor wafer, to pick up the die, transfer it on a transfer stamp, and then release it and attach it to the backplane. I'm going into the details, but we've definitely identified dozens of technologies. But what's interesting is that we're starting to see companies claiming overall assembly and interconnect yields about 99.99, so 4 nines or 4N %, which we consider as I would say, as the minimum threshold to be in the game and to start considering really volume manufacturing. Same thing in terms of the throughput. We're starting to see throughputs about 50 million units per hour, which if you develop an equipment with multiple transfer head, gets you in the game in terms of throughput. No single winner yet. There are many technologies being investigated. As a matter of fact, we see a lot of the largest companies edging their bet and working on multiple technologies. But the bottom line is that we've been working on multiple credible scenarios where the transfer, which at first seemed like very daunting, could become a very minor contributor to the total cost of microLED display. And really, we don't see the transfer anymore as a major showstopper or roadblock. Another cost contributor, obviously, is the die size, the LED cost, and here there's no silver bullet. The cost is essentially proportional to the surface. So to make it palatable by consumers, you need to reduce the die size. We've made all kinds of calculations, and our estimate is that to be viable for consumer displays, for 4K display, the die size needs to shrink to about 10 micron. And unfortunately, by the time, or fortunately for the consumer, by the time microLEDs are ready for prime time, we think that the bulk of the high-end markets that it will address will be in 8K, and that means 4 times more microLEDs, probably the same price than the 4K sales today. So in terms of size, it means you need to decrease the die size by another factor of 4 to about 5 microns. And what's very interesting with microLED is that you can do this exercise for every single application, and in the end, it's not really the performance that's driving the die size, it's really the economics. And if you look at smartwatch and automotive applications, the cost envelope allows you to use die sizes about 10, 20 microns, or say 15 as a proxy. And the good thing with that size is, of course, not everybody, but at least some of the tier 1 fabs, there are probably a handful of LED fabs in the world that are, I would say, almost capable of manufacturing those die. You still need some upgrades here and there, but you don't need to build a greenfield fab. The story is unfortunately very different for most of the consumer applications. For most of the high volume applications that would be capable of moving the needle for the display industry, the die size has to be less than 10 micron. And without going into the details, everything becomes more complicated below 10 micron. You need a different fab, you need different equipment, the transfer and assembly becomes more challenging, and even the LED efficiency is an issue. LED efficiency is one of the key promise of micro-LEDs. And indeed, if you look at the external quantum efficiencies, if you look at traditional LEDs compared to OLEDs, LEDs are definitely much more efficient than OLEDs, and that is true for the three colors. Unfortunately, when you start decreasing the micro-LED size, you can see that the efficiency starts decreasing to the point that, for example, for the red, starting below 80 micron, you start seeing this decrease. And this is, without getting into details, is due to sidewall damages that are created during the manufacturing process. And obviously, the smaller your LED die is, the closer or the more significant the sidewall damage is, or their impact becomes more significant. So it's to the point that when you have micron LEDs, your efficiency, except for the blue, your efficiency is significantly below that of OLED. So this is not an intrinsic characteristics of micro-LEDs. It's just a snapshot of the situation today. Micro-LED companies are improving the efficiencies of small die on a regular basis. But I just want to say it's not a slam dunk. And as of today, in terms of efficiency, if you can use larger die around 15 microns, so applications for wearables and smartwatch, you're probably already as good, if not better, than OLED. But for a smartphone that requires die 5 micron or below, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. Another aspect is the yield. Just want to look at that at a very high level. You have two major components. The first component is the functional yield. By that I mean that when you have, say, a 6-inch LED AP wafers with hundreds of millions of micro-LEDs on it, you're definitely going to have some of those micro-LEDs that are defective. And then you transfer that using a transfer stamp on the backplane. As mentioned earlier, we're starting to see transfer and assembly yields around 4 nines. But for the functional yield, today, the numbers we get from different companies range anywhere between 99% to 99.9. So using 99.5 as a proxy, and because your whole chain is only as strong as the weakest link, it means you have an overall yield of 99.5. And for 8K display, this translates into probably more than 500,000 defective die. So obviously, it's not acceptable for the consumer and means that you need some efficient yield management and repair strategies to be deployed. So without going into the details, the 4 major yield and repair management strategies. The first one consists in basically increasing the functional yield, since this is the weakest link. Let's try to bring it at the same level as the other contributors. Second strategy is to say, well, high number of defects are unavoidable, so let's try to focus on making the repair process as efficient and cost-effective as possible. Another strategy is redundancy, so you just use 2 micro-LED die or more per sub-pixel, and if one is defective, the other one hopefully is going to be working. This is an extremely efficient way of reducing the defect. You reduce defect rate by 3 or 4 orders of magnitude. But obviously, you double the die and transfer cost. The last strategy is testing and binning. So here the idea is to test every single of those micro-LEDs and remove the bad one from the process flows. So you print and assemble good ones. Easier said than done. You need dedicated equipment to efficiently test those millions of microLEDs on wafers in ideally just a few minutes. So we did a lot of cost modeling, look at different scenarios, and the punchline here is really that no strategy has emerged as a clear winner yet. If they are properly executed, every single of those strategies could work. The redundancy is definitely the most efficient in terms of defect reduction, but it's also the most expensive. So it's probably good for first product, but we don't really believe it on the very long term. But as of for now, we see all microLED companies pursuing each their own ways or in some kind of combination of different strategies. So where do we stand? As I mentioned earlier, this year we've seen a lot of first prototypes. So a lot of companies are at this stage of showing the first prototypes. And you do learn a lot when you build the first prototypes, but going from prototypes to a commercial grade display, which is basically absolutely perfect, can be mass produced without defects, very high consistency, homogeneity, etc. It's a different beast, and there's a lot of diminishing return. And to go from the first prototypes to the commercial grade display, you need to build probably hundreds and thousands more prototypes, and this is very expensive. And so this is why we are concerned that for some companies might be entering the valley of death here and run out of funding to do those developments. And once you get to the first commercial grade display, of course, you still have to jump the usual hoops for qualification process, ramping, and all the way through getting the product on the shelves. At the same time, you also need the supply chain. We discussed earlier that today the yields are not very high, and the tools are mostly lab tools. So there is a need to build first pilot line, improve the manufacturing yields, and get some more robust production tools, and then ramp the whole supply chain. So all that is not going to happen overnight. Of course, some companies are probably ahead. Apple has probably spent already more than $1.5 billion on microLEDs, and they're notoriously secretive. So if Apple is ready, you won't see the product until the day Tim Cook steps up on stage and shows it, and it's available next month. So, overall, still a lot of obstacles, but we're really seeing a lot of progress, and we do think it's doable. It's a slam dunk, but we're increasingly and cautiously optimistic about the prospect for microLEDs. So in terms of applications, if you've been following us regularly, we've always been saying that smartwatch and wearable is probably the low-hanging fruit. Automotive is an interesting, probably could be a killer app, because from the automaker perspective, there's everything to like about the technology that has a very high contrast, very, very high brightness, is very rugged, and can operate over a wide range of temperature. The major challenge here is the traditionally very long and complex qualification times, which might delay adoption. Zin mentioned earlier that those luxury, I really don't like to call them TV, because anything above a few tens of thousands of dollars, not really a consumer TV in my mind, but it's definitely a segment that exists, those luxury TVs, such as Samsung The Wall. They're already here, and I think they're going to continuously and incrementally improve as the cost comes down. And then you have augmented reality, and here I'm going to hand the microphone back to Zin, so he can give you a little bit more details about this application. So Zin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Eric. Coming to augmented reality, so regarding microLEDs, it's a bit different from what we've seen. It's not pick and place, it's monolithic, has been explained already. And so augmented reality, what is it? At the end of the day, there's a definition. You can go from a completely real environment towards a completely virtual environment. So here it's a super hot VR. And you've got the virtuality continuum in between. And augmented reality is only a part of this, is being in the middle. But if you are closer to VR, a virtual environment, you have also augmented virtuality. We don't really talk about this. So about augmented reality, what's funny today is that it's still the stuff of dreams against the reality. So through the door of reality, what we have is the VR headsets. They've been consumer products now since the end of 2016. They are here, they are well, they are maybe not working as much as we have, as people would have loved. And then we have the dream for the consumer, which is Jarvis or the guy from Minority Report. And this is what people are expecting from augmented reality. But actually, we don't have that yet. What's for sure, and coming back to everything that's been presented earlier, here we really like to track things with IP, with our sister company Nomade, and the hype on augmented reality and virtual reality is here, and it has been increasing ever so since 2014, when possibly Facebook bought Oculus for $2 billion. And the first patents, what's interesting is that they were filed in the late 80s. This is a very, very old segment, but only now, through all the advancements that we've had, have we seen it thriving a bit more. But as we're going to see, we are still far from reaching the consumer. So what do we do for augmented reality to get into the consumer's hands? It's all about a triptych. First one, it's all about the cost. And what we see today as products available are not really cost-friendly for the consumer. How to say, people can buy smartphones for $1,500, but with the augmented reality headsets that are provided to you today, you can't really do the same thing, so the value is not there for the consumer. Second, it's about the performance, and we still don't have the required performance that's expected for the consumer, and we'll come to that again later. And third and foremost, the most important one, in our opinion, is going to be the form factor. Without a sleek form factor, the consumer is not going to be okay to wear something all day long or to walk with it in the streets. Here is a project that we've had through Disney and Lenovo, but I guess nobody here is willing to wear this while walking in the streets. We had an interesting thing with Intel and the Avon project. It's a really sleek form factor. It really looks cool, like a regular pair of glasses. But what's important here is that the performance was not at the required levels. And that's why it's really about this triangle, if I may say. So usually we talk about displays in our activity, but it's important to note that when you are talking about VR or AR, you can't not take into account the optics, because their choice is going to impact the display, and the display choice is also going to impact the optics. So we always talk about both of them. So this is the backbone of an AR device, simplified, provided by Microsoft. And just want to say that we're going to focus on displays and optics, not on sensors and on anything. And displays and optics both are intertwined for the performance, the cost, and the form factor. So I'll get into the display today. For displays, we have the regular solutions. So here I took a few metrics. Of course, I could take some other ones like contrast, for example, but here this is the most, it's the simpler way to better understand what's the advantage of micro-LEDs. So we've got the legacy technologies with LCOS and DLP. We've got OLED on silicon, which sometimes people call a micro-OLED. And basically, LCOS, DLP are somehow similar. This is very simplified again. OLED on silicon is quite great in terms of display size, because this is self-emissive. So it takes much less space in your headset. So you're going to have a better form factor. But unfortunately, on the brightness, it can't deliver. And on spectral purity, we are not there yet. On top of that, you've got micro-LEDs. So for micro-LEDs, it's supposedly amazing. The pixel density, the brightness, spectral purity, the display size, because it's self-emissive also, has been explained. But the maturity, is very low. And today, we have no consumer product. Many companies are trying to work on that. Lydia, Leti, Glow, Plessy, etc., etc., etc. But we are still far from a product yet. The thing is, if we can deliver on the micro-LEDs for augmented reality, it can really be an enabler. And now we're going to talk about the optics to explain why is that so. So basically, you need some combiner optics, and you can go either the regular optics way, if I may say so myself, or the waveguide combiners. So waveguides are the things that are going to allow you to have a regular lens, very thin lens, that looks like a pair of glasses actually, and that's going to combine the light that comes from somewhere and bring it to your eye. So there are many different technologies, and here we're going to talk about the DOEs and the HOEs. And here below we've put a couple of examples of companies involved. Again, this is not an exhaustive list. So for the DOEs, or what we call the surface area gratings, this is the most widespread technology maybe. So this is an infamous one of Microsoft, or Vuzix, for example, all coming back from very old patents from Nokia. And okay, this is done on glass. You have to micro-pattern your glass to have those small structures, and those are going to act on light, diffract it, and then transfer it, and then back to your eye. The thing is, they are not very efficient. We are talking, okay, let's say roughly 1%, but probably a bit less. So let's put ourselves in a situation. Imagine you are outside. It's very sunny outside. It's very bright. You have a direct sun reflection that goes to your eye. This is about 5,000 nits. So if you want to be able to see something coming from your display, you are expecting, okay, we put 10,000 nits here just for the sake of the demonstration. So given the efficiency of the DOEs, what we should expect to have out of our display and directly out of our display for 5K nits outside is having 3 million nits output for the display, which is something that no technology can deliver today. And that's something that's possibly solved by micro-LED technology, forcibly being able to deliver this huge amount of nits. And it's all linked to the very poor efficiency of our waveguides here. Another route that's been followed by many, here represented, is going the holographic way. Instead of micro-patterning your glass with photoresist and all, you could do some holographic optical elements. We don't have time to get into the details here, but what's interesting to note is that more than a year ago, Aconia Holographics has been bought by Apple. So we're not saying that because Apple bought them is the best technology, of course. It's just to show that it's possibly a credible alternative, and it's been one of their first moves into the AR world for hardware. And I'm really talking about hardware here. Okay. Now, what's to keep from all this is that there are many challenges. We've breezed through them very quickly, and the consumer electronics revolution is not there yet. We've been promised that those AR headsets are going to replace all our smartphones. That's not going to be the case. Again, because of our three different parameters: the cost, the performance, and of course, the form factor. And what we have been promised actually ended up looking like this, because we've had many promises without looking at the technology and how it works and what can really be delivered to people. But again, coming back to micro-LEDs, we do expect that the waveguides are going to be the dominating technology for the years to come. And if micro-LEDs really can deliver, then we are expecting that their market share, penetration rate, is going to increase even more in the near future, because it's an enabler for the sleek form factor, and their brightness compensates the low efficiency waveguiding technology. Again, it's maybe the wrong question, because the optics are not very efficient. We should have a better display. Maybe it should be the other way around. Maybe it could be a two-sided effort. But then again, this is the status of AR today. And now I'm going to hand back the microphone to Eric, because he's going to talk about the future of micro-LED applications, and we'll possibly see what could be happening. Eric, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So going back to the key applications. Now, looking at smartphone, clearly highly desirable applications in terms of volume of revenue. Unfortunately here, unfortunately for microLEDs, the OLED are already doing a very good job, and they're improving in terms of performance, decreasing in cost on a regular basis. And this is going to be very hard to beat, and for microLED, very difficult to find any element of differentiations. And because of that pressure put by OLED, in terms of die size, you need to go to very small die size, and as we mentioned earlier, this compounds all the technical challenges. So this makes, in our opinion, smartphone by far the most challenging applications for microLED. We are not saying it's impossible, but it's definitely a very hard nut to crack. Then what does this leave us in terms of high volume consumer product? Basically TV. So here also very challenging for microLED to differentiate against OLED. Today we only have one OLED technologies on the market, but more are coming. And by the time microLED are ready, some of those technology will be well established. But there's at least one element of differentiation that we perceive as possibly very strong for microLED. It's the fact that it's basically the only technologies that allows bezel-less, seamless styling of displays, because we don't need any seal, any encapsulations. So you can actually design microLED displays, style them, and with that create arbitrarily large displays and TVs. So this is what Samsung has done with the microLED, 75-inch microLED TV they showed at CES last January, and we're pretty confident that they will show some iteration of this product at the next CES next month. Tiling is not easy and straightforward, but it's definitely doable, and there are some credible proof of concepts out there. So let's look at the TV market. TV market has been essentially flat in terms of units. In terms of surface area, it's been going up because the average size of the TV keeps going up. But since the end of the cathode ray tube replacement cycle, panel makers, TV makers have been kind of scrambling to bring in new features or improve performance in order to compel the consumer to go back to the store and upgrade its TVs. So there are a lot of new TV features that you see listed on that graph on the left. The most compelling right now, the most likely to bring people back to the store are maybe resolution with 8K, but most probably the better pixels, so high dynamic range, better contrast, wide color gamuts, also improved motion blur, etc. What's interesting is we are really at a crossroad because there are a lot of new technologies that are now competing to serve or to deliver all those features. I think this is pretty unique in the history of the display industries. To the left, the first column is all the technologies that could improve the well-established LCDs. And at the center, you have all the self-emissive technologies. So today, the only one available on the market is the LG's white OLEDs. Samsung is developing the QD OLEDs, and many companies are developing solution-printed, inkjet-printed RGB OLEDs. So with all those self-emissive technologies, today white OLED is probably a little bit less than 2% of the market in unit. And we believe that all those self-emissive technology combined by 2025 will probably still be less than 10% in terms of unit. But because they're high performance, they address the high-end segment of the market, and they could represent more than 25% of the revenue, which explains why most companies are focused and investing on those. So if you want more details about all technologies and features, I encourage you to read our full next generation TV panel reports. But here, one of the punchline is that LCD is not disappearing anytime soon. It's still about 98% of the TV capacity, and it will still be about 90% by 2023. And there's a lot of capacity out there, and panel makers are not going to be wanting or willing to shut down all those facilities, at least until they're fully depreciated. So speaking of capacities, I'm going to move fast on this one in interest of time, but we were really heading toward a wall. Earlier this year, if you looked at all the capacity that was planned, we are going to go into a really long-standing, long-term excess capacity. And we saw that in 2019 with inventory rising, prices coming down at or sometimes below cash cost. So there's no silver bullet here, and the only way to solve that, you can reallocate capacity, delay, ramp up, etc. But at some point, you need some attrition. And Korean companies, LG and Samsung, are probably leading the charge right now. We hear LG saying that they might cut their LCD capacity almost in half over the next year or so, and Samsung is also doing similar capacity reduction. The problem is that when you enter a period like that where cash is hot, and it's also the time where you need to invest massively on new technologies. Samsung announced in October they're spending more than $8 billion in converting some LCD fab to their new QD OLED technologies. They're spending another at least $2 billion on R&D. Probably not only on QD OLED, probably also include some EL QD, which we believe is the end game for Samsung. LG also spending a lot of money to build their new white OLED fab in China, and the upcoming fab, the Gen 10.5 in Korea. So a lot of cash needed. And coming back to microLED, this is where they might also be disruptive. If you compare the traditional supply chain, very vertically integrated, very high capex required, there are many possible scenarios for microLED supply chain, but there's one scenario you could imagine where you get rid of the TFT, you use silicon CMOS microdrivers, and you can have those microdrivers made by a traditional CMOS foundry. You can have the microLED chip made by traditional LED makers. And then you could just manage the supply chain and virtually eliminate the traditional display makers from the supply chain. So we're not saying this is what's going to happen, but it's one possible scenario. Of course, traditional display makers are trying to avoid this situation, but it's a compelling scenario for a company like Apple or Huawei, for example, who want a highly differentiating technologies and will probably like becoming more independent from their leading display suppliers, which in some cases are also their competitors. A final word on mini-LED, micro-LEDs. I think by now you probably understand you cannot really distinguish them just by sizes. It's a combination of size, technologies, manufacturing processes, and application. If you look at chip size and design, the mini-LED are just a scale down of traditional LEDs, whereas micro-LED, especially below 15 micron, brings new challenge, new architecture to deliver high efficiencies. Same thing can be said in terms of manufacturing. Micro-LED needs new fabs, better lithography tools, new tools, etc. In terms of assembly, you can assemble mini-LED with traditional technology, but there is indeed a need for better technologies. And we are seeing companies such as Rohini, Kulik, and Sofas, and others coming up with better assembly technology that improve the throughput by at least 1 or 2 orders of magnitude. But for micro-LED, you need at least 5 orders of magnitude, and you need massively parallel transfer technology. Then in terms of application, as Dean mentioned earlier, for mini-LED, it's really just a supercharged, improved LCD, whereas micro-LED are an entirely different technologies in itself. So overall, we really see the mini-LED as an incremental evolution, whereas we see the micro-LED as a possible disruption. Still, a lot of things need to happen to make it real, but there's definitely an increasing amount of effort going there. So this concludes our webcast today. Thank you for your attention. I'm going to hand the microphone back to our MC today.
Thank you very much, Eric, and thank you very much, Zine, for your relevant presentation. We are going to conclude with a Q&A session, but we run out of time, so maybe just some time.
There's been a slight technical difficulty, so I'll get back to the question, which was what's the best pick-and-place method for micro-LEDs? As I was saying, at the end of the day, there are many different choices for the technology, as has been explained by Eric earlier. It's very hard to say that one is much better than the other. If that were the case, we would already have some equipment manufacturers that would have said, okay, this is the path to take, this is the equipment that we're going to make. Of course, there are a couple of ones that are maybe slightly better, but only thing that we can say is that we seem to see a trend towards using more laser-based process, possibly. And, well, it would require much more in-depth investigation to be able to tell you what's the best. Thank you, Faisal. Another question, maybe?
Yes, another question. Could you... okay, we have multiple questions, so we'll take some time to reply, but maybe this one could be quick. What do you make of OLED on SI for virtual reality?
Thank you, Faisal. That's an interesting question. So we talked about augmented reality, and we said that maybe it's going to be tight for OLED on silicon because of the brightness issue. This brightness issue is not a real one for VR, but okay, we've seen two different ways to use them. The first one as a regular panel for the VR headset. It's been a project between Spain, Germany, France with micro-LED micro displays. It's nice and all. The only issue is that the optics are very complex to make. So at the end of the day, you're going to end up with something that has a better form factor. It's not going to be as bulky as those headsets that you can buy today, but the optics are very complex to make, and so we are not expecting this to have a very consumer-friendly price point. And on top of that, since you have a small screen, you are ending up with a kind of a small field of view, and this is one of the factors that the consumers really like. Now you can also use these OLED on silicon panels for an additional display. This is the path that's taken by Vario. I'm sorry if I don't pronounce this right. The only thing is that, again, this is not for consumers. It's at a very high price point, but what's nice is that it can give you a foveated rendering onto your eye, and having tried one, it's very interesting. But again, not very consumer-friendly product in terms of price, in my opinion.
Thank you, Zin. Sorry, the webcast is ending. We won't be able to answer all the questions, but we will do our best to do it by email. So just to remind you, within the next 24 hours, you will receive an email that will include the recorded session. Feel free to share the presentation with who will benefit from the information that has been presented, and find all our analyses and reports on our website, i-micronews.com. Thank you for joining us today. Do not hesitate to contact us if you have additional questions. You can find your appropriate contact on the last slide of the presentation. Have a good day and happy holiday season.
Merry Christmas, everyone.
Merry Christmas.